think we are going to get going. So welcome, everybody. Welcome. My name is Danielle. Thank you very much for joining me today in cooperation with Conveyancing Data Services. It's our first webinar together this year. So a little bit of housekeeping before I start the presentation. You should be able to see a control panel on your screen, which allows you to ask written questions. Please feel free to submit questions as we go along, and I'll either get them answered during or after the webinar. We will have a copy of the slides and a recording of this webinar made available afterwards, so please do reach out to us if you'd like a copy of either. I'm sure everybody's still kind of working from home. Apologies if there's any strange background noises. Hopefully you can hear me fairly clearly, and there aren't any problems with the audio. But do reach out to us if there's any technical issues as well. And as always, we've got a little quick feedback survey that will launch after the webinar, and we'd really love it if you could take a few seconds to answer those questions for us and help us improve our presentations for future. So let's get started. Today we're going to start really talking about maps. So maps represent the knowledge of time and space within which they are compiled and produced, and in this way they form a huge part of our historic record. An old map essentially is a picture, albeit it's a little bit selective, of the past and forms a baseline for studying change. And when acquiring a property, whether that's to live in or to be used as a business or for redevelopment, understanding any potential liabilities ahead of purchase really is essential. So in this presentation, we are going to look at historic mappings, its origins, and its importance in our environment and the environmental data that we use for our reporting, and effectively how it will benefit you and your clients. So today we're going to start at the very beginning and the foundation of all environmental data, which is mapping. Now, Britain's mapping agency has its roots in military strategy, mapping the Scottish Highlands following a rebellion in 1745. Later, as the French Revolution rumbled on the other side of the English Channel, there were fears that bloodshed might sweep across our shores. And so the government ordered its defense ministry of the time, the Board of Ordnance, to begin a survey of England's vulnerable southern coast. Until then, maps had lacked the detail required for moving troops and planning campaigns. So starting in 1747, it took 8 years to complete what was known as the Great Map, at scale of 1 to 36,000, so it's 1.75 inches to a mile. Roads, hills, rivers, types of land cover, and settlements were all recorded. And William Roy described it as rather a magnificent military sketch than a very accurate map of the country. Now, Roy's surveying parties of about 8 relied on simple surveying compasses to measure the angles, and chains up to 50 feet long to measure distance between important features. Much of the rest was actually sketched in by eye. On the 21st of June in 1791, it's officially recognized as the birth of the Ordnance Survey. In 1801, the first official OS map was published, and these early maps, with their elaborate hill shading and attention to communication routes, highlight the emphasis given to military use. Now, in time, this military face would actually quite soften, and the map design was developed to appeal to a much wider audience. And it was thought 50 years would be long enough to map the whole country, but the entire first series wasn't actually published until 1870. In 1841, the Ordnance Survey Act formalized the OS in law and gave right to enter any land for purpose of surveying. And the OS is responsible for naming conventions as well. Formerly, places may have more than one name or be spelled in various different ways. Now, at Groundsure, we have a very comprehensive collection of historic maps, around 1.5 million. And these were sourced directly from the Ordnance Survey in Southampton, as well as Trinity College in Dublin. And the OS has changed from a centuries-old venerable mapping company into a really massive big data powerhouse. And for those who have ever had the privilege and the chance to go to the OS, it's really quite impressive. Their offices in Southampton and the capabilities they have in the mapping, how much mapping technology has really come a long, long way. So how does this relate to contamination, and what is contamination? So the legal definition of contaminated land when assessing sites under Part 2A of the Environmental Protection Act 1990 is basically fairly straightforward. I think most of you already know it. Land can actually be contaminated, but not meet the legal definition that's in the actual legislation. Now, contamination can arise from a wide range of historic and current activities. So places like gasworks, factories, garages, petrol stations, current landfill sites, historic landfill sites, all of these give rise to a whole host of contaminants, including heavy metals such as arsenic and lead, oil, tar, chemicals, even radioactive substances. As the current owner or occupier of a property or a site, they can be held responsible for cleaning up the contamination, even if they didn't actually cause it. So it's really vital to understand a site's history. And the best way to do this is through historic mapping and environmental assessments. So today we're really going to go through quite a fair few examples of historic contamination and how different types of contamination can impact property. So we're going to start with this particular case, which is Powys County Council versus Price. So Part 2A of the Environmental Protection Act 1990 provides a framework for identifying contaminated land and allocating responsibility for that remediation. It is the key piece of legislation relating to historic contamination in a sense that it imposes liabilities in respect of acts done in the past. Now, local authorities have a statutory duty under the EPA 1990 to investigate and secure remediation for contaminated land in their area. The local authority can ask appropriate persons to pay for the remediation works, investigations, and/or monitoring. Such appropriate persons should include an innocent owner, buyer of a residential or commercial premises where the contamination is historical or is of a historical nature and the original polluter can't be identified or located. So unfortunately, that's how it is at the moment, whereby if you've got somebody looking at a piece of property and it is found to be contaminated later on down the line, even if they didn't actually do the pollution themselves, if they can't find who did, you could be made liable for that. The costs surrounding the cleanup of contaminated land could potentially cost tens of thousands of pounds. Also, if contamination is found, then this could have a severe impact on the market value of the property. I think that's fairly obvious. Now, Powys County Council versus Price back in 2018. So this particular case, the Court of Appeal held on the 27th of July that Powys County Council was not liable for pollution created by its statutory predecessor, council landfill operator. The important judgment, or this particular judgment, is quite important because it increases the liability risk for landowners and occupiers near operational and historic council landfill sites. The contaminated land regime rules that under Part 2A of the EPA, those who caused or knowingly permitted that contamination, and I'm going to say i.e. the Class A person, must be targeted for remediation costs first. Now, if no Class A person can be found, then the innocent landowner or occupier could be liable as a Class B person. At the heart of the case was whether Powys was seen to have taken over the liabilities of its statutory predecessor, Brecknock Council, when it was created in 1996, and was therefore responsible for the management of landfill sites by Brecknock. The Court of Appeal held the Powys Council did not take over the Class A causer liabilities of Brecknock, since those liabilities were not created until 2001, 5 years later. The previous councils being no longer in existence meant that they could not be found as a Class A causer. Like Powys initially did, a great many local authorities had assumed that responsibility for waste sites and tips operated by predecessor councils would naturally fall to the council in existence today. Now, Groundsure data shows that there are around 9,600 landfills or refuse tips across England and Wales that could have been the local authorities' responsibility, which now may become orphan sites. This ruling underlies that no one in any land transaction can assume that liabilities will be held by another party, and highlights the crucial importance of doing full environmental due diligence on every transaction. Just because government capital funding has been withdrawn from the contaminated land sector, it does not mean the underlying issues associated with contaminated land have disappeared. Historic contamination is still an issue in every property transaction, and it is vital that purchasers ensure they have access to the most accurate information to help them understand the risk. And this is where, we hope to be able to help you and your client. Now, moving on to this particular example. Hopefully nobody takes offense at the title of this slide. But from the title of this, you're probably thinking we've gone a bit mad. This particular area, which got nicknamed the River of Jizz, was rather an uncomplimentary nickname given to Stewards Brook, which runs through St. Michael's Golf Course in Widnes. As we know, the UK has a strong industrial legacy, resulting from the Industrial Revolution, but many of our homegrown industries have been in decline in the last few decades. But what has remained is, big parts of the country transforming land use into something else, not always with the desired effects. Now, one of our Groundsure colleagues recently wrote a blog on golf courses and their previous uses. Using our historic mapping and other third-party data we overlaid all active golf courses, which led us to identify that 393 golf courses across the country are located on former landfill sites and refuse heaps. A further 217 golf courses intersect with formerly potentially contaminated land uses, which is exactly what we see here with St. Michael's. This course actually hit headlines quite a few times over the years. The original St. Michael's Golf Course was created in the 1970s on the northern section of a former chemical tip that was used for depositing industrial waste products. During its early years, players losing their balls would climb into Stewards Brook, which ran through the course, to find the balls had instantly corroded. Stewards Brook eventually acquired the less than complimentary nickname of the River of Jizz from local golfers on golf course review sites, warning fellow golfers against entering the actual brook. It later transpired that this brook and many other parts of the course were contaminated due to the presence of galagoo, an unpleasant yet locally widespread byproduct of the alkali industry that contains high levels of arsenic, plus many other heavy metals. The course was eventually closed in 2004 and designated as contaminated land, and has since undergone extensive and expensive remediation work. So here's a really, really good example of historic contamination. And a lot of the time at Groundsure, we get a lot of people who say, well, who cares what used to be there a long time ago? Who cares what used to be there 100 years ago? And actually, a lot of cases, the older an industry is and the more historic it is, the more potential it has to be a contamination risk, because back in the day, we didn't really think too much about what some of these chemicals and pollutants would do over time. Now moving on to the southeast. So this is actually not too far from where I am. This is the Brighton Hove Gas Works, which is situated at Shoreham in West Sussex, and has operated for over 100 years until its closure in the 1970s. Back in 1875, there was a really strong storm that was blowing in at the same time as a high tide. And the result was that the sea had come over the beach and joined with the canal located within the gasworks, flooding the gasworks to a depth of about 18 inches. And this proved to be a fairly common occurrence at this site. This happened quite a lot. The land and groundwater beneath was known to be variously and widely contaminated by a range of substances, including coal tars and other pollutants. Now, in 1999, a warning was published cautioning that mussels found near the old gasworks contained a high level of contamination, which could lead to serious illness, including cancer. Now, this was proven in a scientific paper a year later, which was published in the Marine Pollution Bulletin. Now, the severe winter of 2013-2014 removed around half a meter of sand from Portslade Beach, with low spring tides exposing new localized rock outcrops. And, with these storms, a neat dark brown tar oil was actually seen coming out from the fissures and gaps in the rocks. At the time, the exact nature and origin of this liquid wasn't known, but the seepages caused staining and a heavy sheen. And this, together with, a powerful creosote-like odor, was impacting the amenity value of the beach and the local residents. So a credible source existed, in the historic gasworks, but it was unclear how the tar seepage was found so far down the beach, and around, after 50 years that the gasworks closed. And again, this is a really good example of really old historic contamination. Now, this posed potential risk to beach users as well as local residents. Public Health England and Brighton Hove Council decided the situation could not go unresolved, and therefore an external consultant was appointed to review the historic site information, existing borehole chemical data, and investigate why the seepage was occurring. And the ground investigation commenced in November 2015, with monitoring continuing over the spring low tide events of 2016. Now, the seepage and associated odor was a high-profile issue for the local community, but the appointed consultants managed to clean up the site effectively, which is great news. However, seepage still does seem to occur annually and was subject of a beach closure only last August of last year. So when we do get inclement weather down here, and if the conditions are right, you still get stuff that comes out, even though the site's been remediated. So this is a really good demonstration of how difficult it is to remediate these types of sites as well. And so it is really just impacting the local area, albeit not every day, certainly once in a while. And it does make you question when you're getting in the sea whether or not it's safe to do so at times. Another historic industrial use is gasworks, and this has actually been in the news fairly recently. There are many other land uses that can cause contamination, like factories, mills, refineries, landfills. So these types of industries can contaminate the ground with heavy metal, arsenic, lead, oil, tar, as I've mentioned previously. Now, our country has had a huge amount of industrial history, and that's why there's a huge amount of a legacy contamination. This gasworks are very, very much prone to being linked to blue billy, which is a type of visible contamination. Blue billy was first identified in London in the 19th century, which led to complaints and troubles by early engineers. It was a waste product from early gas works, which used a wet lime purification process. Unlike other waste products like tar and liquor, it cannot be sold, which made it kind of problematic to get rid of. In the early years, blue billy seems to have been stored in tanks on site and illegally disposed of in sewers. Commissioners of sewers took action to prevent gas industry wastes like blue billy using their system without approval. Generally, such wastes weren't allowed to enter the sewage system at all. Most early complaints of blue billy was actually for its smell. However, it is a noxious and toxic waste which has been dumped in watercourses, resulting in numerous pollution incidents, and the full extent of health implications were not understood for many years later. It's still commonly found on sites of historic gasworks and coke works throughout the country. Now, blue billy contains high levels of cyanide and ammonia compounds, and if it's untreated, it can lead to chronic risk to health. It's extremely toxic to humans, and death can occur rapidly after ingestion of a pretty small amount, i.e. a few grams. It limits the absorption of oxygen at the cellular level and can cause acute toxic effects, like the loss of consciousness and breathing difficulties. Now, cleanup for urban gasworks with blue billy can be extremely expensive. Usually smaller Victorian sites, they usually consist of removing the worst material, and they tend to be moved to a landfill site away from town. Remediation of larger sites, such as an industrial coke works, has required a more selective approach, as the volumes and site values involved have been too large to justify just kind of picking it up and putting it somewhere else. These can include bioremediation, which involves mechanically working the soil to expose it to air, sunlight, and bacterial action, which helps, make that substance less toxic. But from a more recent occurrence, residents of areas surrounding a gasworks are claiming that the remediation of gasworks are detrimental to the health of the local residents. And again, this is based in Brighton as well as London. Now, Dr. Ian Mudway, a lecturer at Imperial College and a member of the environmental research group, has said there was still a gap in understanding about the risks of building on brownfield sites when we are considering building new housing, particularly when it's targeted at vulnerable communities. We need to adopt the precautionary principle. Public health is guided by the precautionary principle, but this doesn't always apply to planning. And this is still very much up for debate, and further research is necessary. It was stated by Keely Bignell, a local resident and environmental scientist, who had warned councillors that dangerous toxins could harm people in Brighton if plans to build homes on an old gasworks went ahead. Keely Bignell said toxins such as lead, asbestos, could be released into the atmosphere from the Marina Way site, which is actually near the Brighton Marina. And Dr. Bignell said that the people living near a similar scheme in Southall in London were taking legal action after reporting increases in cases of asthma, nausea, chest pain, and cancer. So it's definitely something to obviously bear in mind. And again, there's all these different types of gasworks dotted all around the country. So understanding what a site used to be built on is extremely important. Moving on to another type of potential issue, and again, historic mapping is key. Petrol stations only tend to be labeled as such on a large scale map. They will only be labeled either as a filling station or a petrol station if no other services are offered, such as selling food or a cafe, where they can be labeled as a garage. If in this case, we do recommend that you need to know definitively if petrol was sold. There are actually a few distinctive features to look out on when you're looking at mapping, like you see on the screen. While it might be obvious for existing petrol stations, some that have been converted may not be as obvious. So if you're using something like Google Street View or undertaking a site investigation, a few obvious features to look out for are the interceptors. So these look like manhole covers, and interceptors are usually in groups of 3 and they're all right next to each other. And a few telltale signs when you're looking at historic maps are also 2 entrances or exits. So anything like that might denote that it used to be an old petrol station. A canopy, as these are open-sided structures, they will be represented on mapping with things like dashed lines, like what you see on the screen here. Rather than a solid line, such as can be seen in the image on the left. So if you or your client are unclear on whether a petrol station was sold, a few obvious signs are things like interceptor covers or manhole covers and vent pipes, as well as the open-sided canopy. When converted to uses such as a car wash, the interceptors and vent pipes are usually left in situ, so should be a clear indicator when undertaking something like a site investigation or looking at, using tools like Google or Street View. Now, why are petrol stations an issue? In July 2014, 23,500 liters of fuel spilled from Tesco Haslingden petrol station in Rosendale over a period of 24 hours. The spill wiped out 90% of fish, including brown trout in the nearby river Irwell, with oil detected 3 miles downstream. Over 40 dead fish were found in 1.5 miles of where the pollution entered the watercourse, with anglers reporting dead fish over 6 miles downstream in Bury. Residents were evacuated due to the fumes coming from the sewer network, and people up to 1 kilometer away sought medical attention for headaches and sickness. Now, a joint investigation by the Environment Agency and Lancashire County Council discovered how Tesco failed to address the station's faulty fuel delivery system, poor alarm system, and inadequate emergency procedures in response to the petrol leak, which lasted 29 hours. And Tesco were fined £5 million for the health and safety offences and £3 million for the environmental offence. Now, the pollution emergency spanned from the 2nd to the 3rd of July 2014. Triggering a huge multi-agency operation involving the EA, the local county council, United Utilities, Lancashire Fire and Rescue Services, and Lancashire Police. And Tesco's was prosecuted for breaching regulations. And on top of the £8 million penalty, Tesco was also ordered to pay the EA costs of roughly just under £35,500 and about £22,000 to Lancashire County Council. And I'm sure, as you can imagine, for residents in the nearby area, that could also be a concern. So petrol stations, regardless of whether they are currently in use or historic, do pose certain issues from a contamination perspective, regardless of whether they are, like say, in current use like this Tesco's or an old historic one. And so if you are working with any developer clients, or if you've got any clients that are looking at possibly new builds, understanding if they're on an old petrol station is actually quite useful to know, because it can, of course, pose its own issues. Now, what else can we glean from old mapping and contamination? A huge amount of our database, and we have a separate database for this that sits underneath our overall historic mapping, are military sites. Now, Staniel Baldwin was a British conservative statesman who dominated the government of the United Kingdom between the World Wars, serving as Prime Minister on 3 occasions. Now, censorship of mapping started in 1927 with the well-founded fears of a wartime aerial blitz. Around the time, Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin warned that the bomber will always get through, and he secretly instructed that no work of defense shall appear upon any map on sale to the general public. No blank space shall appear, but the natural physical features of the country shall continue to appear. And map makers eventually protested that there was no point in deleting, for example, power stations, because the power lines converged on a mysteriously blank spot. So as you'll be able to see in the following slides, some of the attempts to kind of mask certain features were more successful than others. So this particular area is ROF Risley. So this was a large World War II Royal Ordnance factory used for filling munitions, including the Grand Slam bomb in the UK. It is located roughly halfway between Liverpool and Manchester. There were 16 filling factories around the country, and Risley was known as filling factory number 6. Now, the location was chosen because the low-lying mist could help camouflage the factory from the air, according to the local builder. You know, they like all the cloud cover, but as you can see here, you can see some of the attempts to conceal the land uses were more successful than others. One of the features common to all the filling factories was an area of storage bunkers where the finished munitions were stored awaiting dispatch. The areas within the filling factories were all numbered in the same way. Storage bunkers were designated Area 9. Risley had 20 such bunkers, and Area 9 is roughly in the area of the main field in Birchwood Forest Park today. So when the new town area of Birchwood was created, most of the bunkers were demolished, but 4 of them were left in place and actually can still be seen to this day. Now, a number of bunkers were also built to house the munitions to protect them from potential bombing, and also to segregate the site and reduce the consequences of any accidental explosions during the manufacture or storage. Although these bunkers are on the surface, they are covered with soil and turf, and so give the impression of being underground. It had a dedicated rail link to the Manchester-Wigan branch line, which was used for both bringing in workers and moving materials. However, after World War II, the factory was soon overshadowed when, in January 1946, the Directorate for Atomic Energy Production, under the aegis of the Ministry of Supply, was set up to produce fissile material, and chose Risley to build its headquarters under the control of Sir Christopher Hinton, Baron Hinton of Bankside. This project to produce a nuclear weapon, or A-bomb, was by far the UK's biggest industrial and scientific undertaking in peacetime, requiring most of the country's top scientists and a huge budget and scale that couldn't really even be contemplated these days. The early atomic site used many of the old Royal Ordnance factory buildings, and also the dedicated rail link to the Manchester-Wigan branch, bringing in workers from Manchester. Now, the lack of availability of records concerning military sites is a major problem. Information relating to site layout, processes, and materials used and produced on site may not readily be available. The main reason for this is a past desire to keep such sites secret particularly during wartime, which is understandable. Information concerning these sites were often lost or dispersed after the wars, or as a result of reorganization of government departments. Whilst former MOD land may have been subsequently used for other purposes, the decommissioning and remediation standards employed in the past are unlikely to meet present-day requirements. Additionally, the MOD commonly burnt unwanted materials, which could give rise to a number of issues. Now, Groundsure were recently informed by one local authority that they consider all MOD land as potentially contaminated. This came about after it was discovered that the barracks at Deep Cut found that the barracks were set alight, leaving a burnt asbestos layer with significant asbestos-containing materials and loose fibers in the soil. So again, really old historic issues, really old historic contamination, but still definitely a concern even to this day. Now here is a map of an area of Coventry, which, as you can see, was home to the Triumph Motorcycle Works. So again, this isn't necessarily military sites, but bomb damage is also a bit of an issue, or can be a bit of a historic issue. On the 14th of November 1940, the German Air Force launched its most devastating bombing raid of the Second World War. The target was Coventry, a manufacturing city in the heart of England with a beautiful medieval centre. Now, the result was a shocking collapse of social order that caused thousands of people to flee, with thousands of homes and industries destroyed or damaged. So without official bomb damage maps, can historical maps give you an indication of where bombs were dropped? And the answer is yes, it can to a certain degree. So here is now a map of 1949, some 24 years later and post-war. And you can see a few areas that were hit during the Blitz. The label ruin on historic map implies war damage and the possible need to get something like a UXO assessment or an unexploded ordnance. And just going back to this, actually, it was maybe a few years ago. It was in London in the theatre district that they actually during construction found a bomb, an old World War bomb on an old construction site, and they had to evacuate a whole bunch of hotels and theaters in the vicinity to basically make sure that it didn't go off and were able to dispose of it properly. So again, even to this day and age, this stuff crops up. Now let's take a look at unlabeled infrastructure. So during the Cold War, the Ministry of Defense listed 4,800 key points to be deleted. Martin Furnival Jones, who became head of MI5, worried about saboteurs. He wanted oil refineries, gasworks, and railway bridges to be removed, even insisting all factories should have their role concealed because it would be useful to any agent. So this is the origin of the uninformative word that you get on mapping sometimes, works, which appears on maps to this day. And their distinguishing feature is the black shading on that map, as you can see on the screen. This indicates essential infrastructure or important buildings, but you don't necessarily know what they are. And so sometimes you may see in our reports that a property may be either in or near works or unlabeled infrastructure. And so it sounds kind of innocent enough, but do not be fooled. In some cases, these may have been any of the number of things that you see on the screen. It could have been gasworks. It could have been all sorts. So that does pose a problem. And to a degree, you wonder whether or not to err on the side of caution or not. And that's what I'm certainly not an environmental consultant, but our environmental consultants are certainly trained to look at all of this stuff and be able to make a much better assessment than I could ever give you. But this is why this stuff is really, really key and also really important. Now let's take a look at, quickly look at reports. We're sort of finishing up now, but quickly looking at reports, and I'll show you kind of which reports this historic mapping and this contamination assessment is always included in. So you have a premium report like Avista, which is basically an all-in-one report. In terms of contaminated land and historic contamination, you are 100% fully covered. To be honest, in all of our core reports, regardless of whether it's Groundsure or Avista or the home buyers, core environmental reports, our core environmental reports are always going to include a contaminated land assessment. So you're always going to have the support and help of an environmental consultant should you or your customer have any questions in regards to the historic use or past use of the land. Generally, for the most part, a lot of the sites pass, and you might on occasion have something identified historically, and if that is the case, we will provide all of the relevant next steps or additional information that you or your client may have to obtain from, like, let's say, the local authority. So all of that's provided. But Avista is the all singing, all dancing one. The one next step down would be a home buyers, which basically has all the core environmental concerns in it: contaminated land, flood, ground stability, radon, but won't include energy, transportation, or planning. And then you've also, from a commercial perspective, got something. All of our commercial reports will provide a fairly comprehensive contaminated land assessment. If you want a full belt and braces, then something that the review would be really appropriate. If you have a client from a commercial perspective that is going to be redeveloping property, then something like the review really looks at everything from, it'll look at the earliest map that we have of the property and give you a full timeline of any significant changes that have happened to that land or property over time from the earliest map we have up until present day. So these types of reports always include this high level contaminated land assessment. So Avista review, we all use the same historic mapping to do these assessments, and then depending on what your requirements are, whether it's redevelopment or not, then the amount of detail may be a little bit less depending on what you're looking at. But all of our reports will use our historic mapping to make sure that we're providing the best assessment that we can for you and your clients. And so that is pretty much it for me today. Hopefully that was a useful kind of examples of historic mapping and how it actually plays into the future. I don't know if you've seen, and there's a lot of talk about redeveloping brownfield sites. And so I would just say, I think we have to do that. That's something that is certainly going to have to take into consideration because we are running out of areas to build. But with that comes, its own concerns, its own historic contamination concerns. And so we want to make sure that, those concerns are being dealt with in the right manner. So thank you very much for joining us today. As I said, if you have any questions, we are here to support you and your clients. So if you've got a client that's making you rip your hair out because there's some historic mapping on one of our reports, you can get them to speak to Groundsure directly, or you can pick up the phone and speak to us and be more than happy to take you through any sort of technical questions or difficult questions you have if your preferred search provider can't answer those questions for you to begin with. Thanks very much for joining me. Have a great rest of the afternoon. And if you could take a few seconds to fill out that survey, we'd really appreciate it. Have a great day.